In case you didn't know what meeting you're in a special called City Council retreat. Welcome. Hope everyone had a nice lunch. You've got an agenda in front of you, and I'm supposed to do the welcome and priority accomplishments. And so I don't think y'all need to hear me give a speech, so I'm just going to roll right into priority accomplishments. The only thing I will say is many of you have participated in these in the past. They are meant to be very interactive, much different than what we traditionally do during a work session where you've got a presentation of information. We want you to give feedback along the way, which is why in the recent accomplishments category, rather than have staff tell you how great they are, what they've done is put together in categories that we've all agreed upon and where our strategic vision is for the city of Fort Worth, an attempt to try to, this is harder to do, but put together a high-level list of accomplishments in each of those categories. I know how much we all love when people read us a PowerPoint, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, all of you've had this information now for a few days. In each of the categories, I think we're probably still okay in, and we'll have time to talk about adjustments to that throughout the day. But as you reviewed each of these accomplishments, starting with economic development and community investment, what I'd like to start with is just asking you to react to what was listed here. Are there things that you feel strongly were missing that reflect the entire city, maybe not in just your district? Or if you disagreed with the things that staff may have highlighted here in that category in particular. So you can move to slide 3 if you don't mind. Thank you. You see you listed everything from A&M, downtown TIFs, working through our community arts center, which is still a work in progress, how to support film entrepreneurship, which we've had a lot of successes there as well. And then moving down into more neighborhood-specific options, which I think our staff should be commended for some of that work as well. React to that for me if you don't mind, and give me your feedback on things that you disagree with, or that you wish we're pushing harder on, or that maybe is missing altogether from these 2 slides before we move to community safety. Macy,
I'll go
please.
first. I do, and I said this in our homelessness/housing workshop, which really was more about housing than homelessness. And I think we can do a better job addressing homelessness in Fort Worth, particularly the poverty issue that happens on the front end for a lot of our families. And what we can do as a council, what can we do as a council to help them, and as a city do better there?
Thank you, Councilmember Hill. Anyone else react to that? Councilmember Beck?
To expand on that, we did in that housing meeting discuss ways to clear barriers to additional housing for permanent supportive housing and affordable housing. And I think we should continue to do so, and what that looks like in from our development services and fee structures.
Well said. Anybody else? Councilmember Bivens.
I'd like to see us partner more aggressively with social service agencies so that we can identify triggers that get us there. And that gives us a more proactive approach to it, because right now it continues to be reaction as to what we do. But if we were to partner more aggressively with MHMR, anybody who does state work, federal work, I think we could be ahead of the game more than we are now.
More coordination, yeah. Carlos.
Maybe a little too early because we just started out with this, but we're doing a public safety assessments, in the West 7th, district, entertainment district, as well as the stockyards. Just taking the first few steps, not complete, but, it's
That's a good point. Yeah. Hold on to that, and we'll get to slide 5 about community safety. That probably pertains there. Anybody else on economic development? I think because of the things that Macy and Elizabeth mentioned, we actually don't talk about homelessness work in either of these 2 slides, and we probably should. And working with staff to sort of lift up what we think are our biggest wins, and even internally where we've fallen short. And it sounds like better coordination and more proactive approach on homelessness, which every city is grappling with this across the country. But as you well know, so much of the money funnels down from federal government, and it's an allotment that we receive, and we celebrate when they give us more money. But it takes a lot of partnership with philanthropy and with city staff and TCHC. So if neighborhood services and Tara and others could work on just a bullet point here to memorialize what we think on the homelessness front, that'd be helpful. Anyone else on these 2 slides before I move on? Anybody think one of these or 2 of these is not worth noting, or feels like maybe it's missed the mark? All good there? Okay. Move to slide 5, which is about community safety. There's some big lifts that I think city staff and each of these departments should be commended for. And importantly, a lot of you on the ad hoc committee around emergency services. So starting with, I'm going to go through these more slowly since there's only 4 on the page. First is for the fire department. That was a pretty monumental task to go through the staffing analysis and actually implement those changes from a budgetary standpoint last budget cycle. I'll speak for myself first to say I think that it's been well received in the public. I think that right-sizing the department was the correct decision and also is helping us sort of navigate what our ambulatory service model needs to be across Fort Worth and Tarrant County as well. So kudos to staff for working through that. On the police department staffing, I will say that this is probably the predominant topic among large cities in the country right now when I meet with mayors, and they're all mightily struggling with recruitment and retention. Chief Noakes does a great job representing the city of Fort Worth, and he doesn't do so through rose-colored glasses, but he is honest about we still have the ability to recruit and retain officers in the city of Fort Worth, and that's in large part to this body being supportive of the department and making sure they're staffed where they need to be. I would add here that we need to keep pressing and making sure they have the support to be fully staffed by 2026, which is ultimately the goal. All of you have said you want more officers in your districts. You hear when you don't have enough MPOs or patrol officers, et cetera. So that continues there as well. And then this last piece, I think we could spend an entire retreat just on our successes and resources put towards a more patient-centric model for emergency medical response. I think this may seem vague to the general public, though. So what do we mean by that? And when I think of that bullet point, I think it should really continue to include everything from CIT enhancements, our HOPE team, the way we are holistically taking care of the wellness of our officers as well, so they can also take care of community. And those investments, you'll kind of be learning a bit more about that in the next month or so as well. And then also what we're doing with the ad hoc committee and what the future of emergency services. Yeah. West 7th as well. Yes, good point. Charlie.
Yeah, I think it's important as we talk about community safety. I mean, we could put a police officer on every corner, and no fault to the police department. They're doing everything they can. But when their hands are tied with, for example, arresting somebody who should be arrested, but they know they're going to turn right back around in a court and go right out the back door for whatever reason, whether it's jails are full or very permissive court system, whatever the case is. I think strengthening the relationship with the courts and them understanding what's actually happening in our neighborhoods and why it's important that we allow our police officers to enforce the laws already on the books. And then having a stronger relationship with our court systems as well well, they understand the same concerns, so.
Thank you, Charlie. Macy?
I don't know if, I guess co-compliance would fit into this category, but I think addressing the loose animals, I know animal control is having a tough time, they're probably understaffed as well, but we've had several dog bites. I know Charlie's had that terrible one that happened a couple months ago, and there's loose dogs all over Riverside and East Lancaster, and just make sure we have the support for them, because we don't want to have another child mauling like Dallas had in 2019. And I think we're on the edge of that. I drive down East Lancaster quite a bit, and there's loose dogs everywhere. We don't need to have that, and whatever resources we need to do to make sure that our public is safe, I think it's important.
Alan?
So, thank you, Mayor. I want to expand a little bit on some of the things that Charlie said. And with regard to our community safety, I really want us to take a closer look at school zones and school crossings and the dangerous situations that we have there. There was one yesterday evening that in Charlie's district that was very emotional for many of us. It impacted a lot of neighbors. And we don't really have a great handle on that, I think. And I think this is a citywide issue, not just Charlie's district, not just my district. So I'd really like to see us take more of a focus on that. And I also want to say, I think we did, as a council, some incredible work with police and fire this past budget cycle. I don't want us to rest on our laurels and say, okay, we're done. I think in both cases, there's some significant improvements that we can still do in the future. Councilman Williams and I had talked about the need for more traffic enforcement in particular as we move forward into the next budget cycle. So I just want to capitalize on the great things, and let's continue to do more to make it even better, make our city even safer.
Makes sense. Any other remarks on this slide, community safety? Yeah, good point. Code is not up here, and the work and reinforcements that code has from an accomplishment standpoint, that's a huge piece of community safety that I think needs to be noted here as well. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I'm glad you said that, because I think what's not missing too is the legal department and the work that they've done, working with code and PD to really go after the nuisance abatements and those harder code issues that are really impacting our neighborhoods.
Question maybe for David or any staff member that helped compile this presentation. Do you feel like you got enough feedback from departments individually to get this list together? Or would it be helpful to ask them to react to this as well? Because I think these accomplishments documents are only as good as the input is from the departments that are actually providing the work out in the field. And I just don't know, I'm just curious how that was compiled, and if anyone wants to speak to that, they can. Christiane got the nod.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I do think it would be helpful to have more departmental input. It helps to hear what you're saying and even gives us a window into fiscal year 25 priorities potentially. But as we look backward to celebrate accomplishments, we can share this with departments and let them react as well.
And importantly, you know, making sure our department heads know this because they have to sit in plenty of meetings with us, but throughout the organization, an understanding of how each department does intersect with each of these priorities for the city. Community safety seems to be the easiest to me. If you're TPW, I mean, everything you do is for community safety. So what are your accomplishments in that department that really are worth noting on this list, which I think would be very important? Parks and Recreation could do the exact same thing. Because I think all of us would benefit from having a document you could tout out in the community about where accomplishments are. And then in addition to that, each of you have district-specific things that you know you've worked on and been priorities for you, or things that you've pushed the city staff to work on alongside you as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Any other things that are big items we want to push on today, or I can keep going through the slide deck? Yes, Gina?
Mayor, my remark starts with a question for the new council members. Has everybody new met Benjamin Samprat? Okay. He's the street fighter. When it comes to nuisance abatements, he's the one who shuts them down. He's very effective. It requires coordination between code and cops. And so my question to Leanne would be, is Benjamin's part of the world adequately staffed? Because people on the east side love him. We've been able to get a few things shut down. And if you don't know Benjamin, you need to meet him.
Yeah, one of the things that we're looking at requesting in the next budget year is an increase to that section. Benjamin has been very effective with the resources he has. We're looking at some other options, perhaps teaming up with the law school. We've been in discussions with them for a good year now to try to figure out some way to basically to have either a clinic or some sort of an externship that's specific to this. So we are on the path to that. But certainly even with that, it's going to require additional people on our staff to help with those students and such. So you will see that as a request from us for this year.
We were able to see a lot of progress after I had Benjamin speak at a District 5 leadership meeting. And those meetings are for my neighborhood officers, and he was able to educate them on what it takes to get a case that he can see it through. And so if you haven't met Benjamin, I encourage you to give him a call. And the more people who call him, the more we help Leanne get some more money. Thank you.
Okay, if nothing else on community safety, let's move to slide 6, which is focused on fiscal responsibility. You see those budget items included there, which I think are all worth noting as accomplishments for sure. Working through implementation of 1822 bond, and the last one is maintaining the city's bond rating, which is very important for a multitude of reasons. Are there things on here that are missing? And importantly, are there things that you think that maybe were amiss, that we didn't do enough on for fiscal responsibility and making sure the city is fiscally sound? Some of you have mentioned, for instance, more money in PAYGO, something you wanted to see for capital projects. Any disagreement on that? I mean, David's done an excellent job during his tenure as city manager of making sure that's a priority and allocating as much as he can every budget. But I think there's some members on this council that would like to see more. At least I've heard that feedback. Anything else here? No? One thing I would just mention on fiscal responsibility that sort of fits in this category, and this is where Alan's going to save the day, right? Alan as our TAD board member, but just a continued effort by this body and the city to make sure we walk alongside taxpayers in understanding our property tax system, which can be mind-numbing. But there is just this level of distrust and concern around property taxes in the state of Texas, and some of that's not our fault at all, and we really are a well-run city. But I think I would encourage us all to not grow weary of those conversations, but just acknowledge that they hate them as much as we do, paying our own property tax bills in the city. And because we do have great representation, I'm being facetious, but Alan has been willing to step up in that role as a TAD board member, which we are immensely grateful for. But as he can tell you, it's hard to explain to people and rebuild trust across Tarrant County and here in the city of Fort Worth. Alan, go ahead.
So thank you, Mayor. And I want to say, is with regard to TAD and with regard to the city of Fort Worth, we've had a lot of discussions already. David and Mark have reached out to Jodan Bobbitt, the new chief appraiser, and are working to schedule a meeting to initiate those discussions there. TAD is required to do 2 open meetings at a different location than their offices over on the east side of town. Both of those will be here at Fort Worth City Hall, so we can give a bigger voice, expand that message further. We're also working towards bringing Jodan here to do a workshop and presentation to council and the community about TAD and a more open and direct role. So everyone hopefully can get a better understanding of how the process works and our engagement in it from the city's perspective and from TAD's perspective as we move into our budget cycle and tax cycle next year.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan. Appreciate that. One thing I know that we need to keep having the conversation on is we reduced the tax rate. We made a priority for over 65 and disabled. A few council members understandably want us to do more even on the tax rate. It doesn't really fit here because it's not an accomplishment for those of you that wanted more, but I think just keep that in mind. You'll have plenty of time to talk about that, especially in the priority-based budgeting conversation and when David kind of talks about the fiscal health of the city. So know that that's coming as well. Anything else? No? Okay, keep rolling. Responsible growth. The 3 things noted here are probably most specific to internal pieces of the city of Fort Worth. So obviously the Fort Worth Lab and Christiane's appointment and Mark's kind of right-sizing the budget office, which we're very appreciative of. Continued planning communications around the new city hall. I think we have lots of communication needed with that, but we'll work through that with city staff over the next several months as we all move in. And then recruitment or retention of top talent. This is a struggle for every business and every industry, as Gina can attest right now. But how the city takes care of our employees is going to be increasingly more important. And making sure we're growing our own talent inside the building. They feel like they have the ability to move up in the organization. And also being one of the most desirable places to work in our region needs to be a priority for us as well. On the responsible growth category, the next one's infrastructure, by the way. So just so you know, that one's not missing from the presentation. Yeah, this is more internal growth, like how the city is really coping with being the fastest growing city in the country. Anything you think we're bad at that you want us to talk about later in the day is okay too to mention here. That's not an accomplishment, but maybe something we really struggle with as an organization. Gina?
I'm sorry to do this, Mayor, but I just noticed you used the term Budget Office. I'm not going to fight with David about this fancy name called the Fort Worth Lab, but the public does not know that that is the Budget Office.
Sure, yeah.
And so thank you for saying that. And David, I'm not fighting, you're my friend, I adore you, but that's, I hate it.
Noted.
But that's not my fight.
Noted. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move in the last one, and, go ahead, I'm sorry. Yeah, Carlos.
Do you have something? Go ahead. Yeah.
I would be remiss if we didn't mention payroll.
Okay.
That is definitely a growth opportunity for us as well. I know I pushed for, and I know Councilman Williams has pushed for a base level of pay for our employees. But I think a lot of that retention and recruitment is because we're not on par with a lot of other organizations. And so I think that's an area for growth as well.
Thank you. Carlos?
I'm not sure where this would go, but do we want to mention in terms, or in the context of development, responsible development, sustainable development, the Good Nature Initiative?
Yeah, good point.
Where
You
do
know,
we put that?
yeah, I think Good Natured was mentioned here in our,
Did I miss it?
very briefly. Where is it? Oh, it's in fiscal responsibilities, kind of buried.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, as long as it's captured, it's good. I miss that, with green space there. Maybe also mention it by name. Yes. Good.
And I think when we get to item 6 on the agenda with Hillary, when we talk about strategic priorities and goals, I think that will be the place to really lift up some of the things we want to continue to push on as well. Okay, I'm gonna move into infrastructure. This could derail because we could all talk about needs of infrastructure. They tried to highlight the things that are worth lifting up as accomplishments. Anybody disagree with these or feel like we're glossing over something? This is always a topic, probably number one for most constituents is infrastructure, lack of redevelopment, new infrastructure, depending on where your district is. Elizabeth?
So, one, I want to say I think we did a good job over the last couple of budget cycles of really prioritizing infrastructure in our budget and in providing a better level of service for our residents. So I don't really have a critique on this one. I just really appreciate staff listening to that. It's hard. We have, Lauren's here, she'll tell me we have, I don't know, 5,000 lane miles or whatever. I know I'm undervaluing it, right? But we have an enormous amount of area that we have to keep track with. I do think that where we struggle is being forward-thinking, and I'm glad to see that you've got the 2050 comprehensive plan on there. But the challenge is going to be is not just how do we put that, how do we implement that? And I think the reason that we're in the place that we're in is because we haven't kept pace with or even tried to get out ahead of some of our big developments. And I think you see that really noticeably in West 7th and the stormwater issues.
Thank you. Jared?
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, I would echo the sentiments. I think we've done really good with infrastructure. And you mentioned earlier with the PAYGO discussion, I think that's something in terms of an area of improvement, particularly because sometimes what's in our capital improvement plan or what we're planning for the bond may not keep pace with what's happening on the development and private sector side. And so I think it's important that we have discussions about how to ensure we have resources available, especially for our arterials when major development is happening along corridors like Risinger, which is the east-west corridor, ensuring that we are nimble enough to be able to partner when private sector value is created that can partner with building those roads. And we do a good job through like the CFA process, et cetera, whenever developments come in. But I think there's opportunities to continue to build on that. And then the other thing is neighborhood streets. I know this particular cycle, our office has gotten a number of inquiries around neighborhood street improvements, particularly resurfacing. And so I think there's also opportunities there in this budget cycle to increase our focus on infrastructural improvements at the neighborhood level and not just on the major projects that we need to get done across the city.
Thank you. Yeah, Charlie?
I think one area where we could do better on the infrastructure side is the messaging, because while things like street striping, actually road repairs, additional mowing, all the things you can see that are like, okay, great, that's where my tax dollars are going, that's where I want them to go, that's great. But some of the really large, expensive projects like replacing cast iron that people don't see, so it's not nearly as sexy, but it's super expensive. I think the messaging on, here's what happens if we don't do it, and here's why we maybe can't lower taxes as much as we want to, or here's where your taxpayer dollars are going, and actually like break it down. I think Mayor Pro Tem did a great job earlier explaining that entire thing she read. It's like, it's gonna keep your toilets from getting clogged up. I think if we can like have a better messaging on, here's why we need to do it now, and if we don't, it's gonna cost us this much, and it's gonna cost you or the neighborhood. So I think messaging the big non-sexy projects in a better way, so we can then get that out to our constituents and say, hey, here's why we're having to spend that much money.
Well said. Carlos and then Macy.
Again, with infrastructure, I would suggest maybe on the second bullet, and when we've done more than evaluate, when it comes to stormwater, through our fee increases, has done some good things already with trying to address, those challenges. I might suggest maybe make it a little more, less passive, right? Maybe we've done more than evaluated, is what I'm saying. Maybe some word changes there. That's it.
Thank you, Carlos. Macy?
I lump sidewalks and infrastructure, and I think our Safe Routes to School program is wonderful. It's really done a great job, but I think as we continue to grow, there's a lot of areas that the kids don't have a safe route to school. They're walking in bar ditches, and I think we can do a better job of evaluating where those gaps are and how we can make sure our kids are safe going to school and getting from these neighborhoods as we continue to grow and the traffic continues to rise.
Yeah.
Maybe tie that in with PayGo investments. For the water department and
I don't know. So I'm going to stop on infrastructure. Is that good? I'm going to give a little direction to staff, then we'll move into the next category for David, which is fiscal health. Feedback for CMO office. I think this won't get used if it's not comprehensive enough, because none of y'all will pay attention to it ever again after today. Fair to say? Okay. So how do we not do that? I think I would suggest going to departments and saying, what would you put in these categories based on your individual department that you think fit in these overall strategic vision priorities that are overarching around quality of life? That makes sense. So they may brain dump and have a lot to put in, but I think it's worth you culling through. The second may be more time intensive for each of you, but think about the things just in the last year that you feel like are specific to your district that fit in these categories that I think should be noted here. And it may be smaller projects, but they were a big deal for your community members and something that took you really working together on. And then you don't have to do it today, but if you have other things that were misses by the city that maybe you're frustrated about as the elected official that haven't happened, either you're getting ignored or stonewalled or there's not enough money, I think that council needs to know that. And there's probably going to be some time to vet some of that today. You'll have plenty of time to vent. But I just think this document, to be any good to anybody else, they're going to need to have that moving forward. Anybody else have any other feedback before I turn it over to David? Yes, Jared.
One thing I failed to mention on the economic development is just the importance of investing in our small businesses. I think there's room to create incentives for our small businesses. They don't necessarily, sometimes they fall through the cracks with our current application process, and they may need a lower dollar amount to really take their business to the next level, but we don't really have any programs necessarily available other than CDFI, which may be a grant or may be a loan. Hopefully it's not a loan, but I think there's room to look at how do we grow small businesses in the city. And then the second thing with that is our MBE performance. And looking at how do we expand capacity and bolster our partnerships, particularly with the Fort Worth Hispanic Chamber and the Fort Worth Metropolitan Black Chamber, to help us move the needle on those MBE goals.
Yeah. One thing that's not on here either, back to economic development, is the work with Main Street America and Northside and with Texas Wesleyan and Rosedale area. Those are two notable projects, I think, that are worth mentioning. Okay. I'm going to keep us going then. Thank you, council, for letting us kick things off there. I'll turn it over to David Cook, who's going to talk about the fiscal health of the city, not the physical health, y'all, the fiscal health. Chris is not even here for my joke. I mean, he was going to give me the dart eyes, and he wasn't here. Okay. David.
All righty. Hey, so what I'm going to do is take a few minutes, some of this information you've seen before. It's simply to get us to start thinking about the upcoming budget. And then overall, just be thinking about how do we determine the fiscal health of the city? And what do we need to be doing in the short term? What do we need to be thinking about long term? You know, we have a work session scheduled for next Tuesday when we're going to talk about, one, the results of a citizen survey and how that stacks up. And some of that is going to get back into what do citizens think about the services we provide and what is top of mind from the citizen standpoint. You're going to hear about infrastructure and roads and things like that, and what's important to citizens, and you're going to hear about infrastructure and public safety. But that's next Tuesday. Reggie's also going to show up and talk about how we did from the prior fiscal year. That first goes to the audit committee. But I think Reggie's got a lot of good news items in that as well. And then we have this item of whether we want to consider a street maintenance fee as a way to pay for infrastructure. And so all this is, I think, pretty timely as we head into the upcoming budget year. These are the policies, philosophies that we've been following for a number of years. And so when you think about, as we approach the budget, as we think about the city's fiscal health, the first part there is we don't do it on an annual basis. We think about it over a long-term perspective. More on that as we go along. We have had a goal over time of reducing the property tax rate. And assessed values have been strong that have allowed us to do that over time. We'll talk about that too. And the emphasis on infrastructure investment and maintaining that infrastructure once it's built. We also don't use reserves or one-time revenues to balance the budget, right? Maintain or improve financial ratings. I'll touch on that just a little bit. And then in true economics, resources are finite, and our role is to figure out what those choices and trade-offs are.
And David, before you keep going, I think I'll just kind of level set before because we can't all glaze over. This is dense. They've done an excellent job trying to prioritize things. I was not here on council. Many of you were not, except for, I think Mayor Pro Tem Bivens was here during the recession. Am I right, Gina? And we have to be prepared for the what if. And I think this management team has done that for the city. We're very fortunate to be in the state of Texas and in North Texas that has been in such a beneficial time period to our economy. We can't pretend that always won't be the case. And so as you're listening to David's presentation, just think about that throughout, because it's just like in our own budgets in our households, we have to be prepared for someone losing a job or a loved one getting ill. And that's sort of the budget philosophy within this document. And I just wanted, David really does deserve a tremendous amount of credit for the philosophy that's throughout the organization. And it wasn't always this way. The second thing I would say is think about those of us on this body, we have to communicate these things to constituents. That's oftentimes very hard to make them understand the trade-offs we're making, how we're prioritizing things. So take note throughout David's presentation of where do we need more help from communications on how to best articulate some of these big priorities for the city in a way that they actually understand, which is sometimes more difficult than others. Sorry to interrupt you, David, just wanted to lay those out.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. We're going to end on some looking at what has happened to other cities in history. And so I do think it's important that we have to keep our eye on the ball. And as we're going to talk about at the end, prosperity is not guaranteed, right? We're riding a very good ride right now. Assessed values are going up. We're in a popular area, but that's not guaranteed, right? So are we doing the things that will guarantee that, or at least preserve it over a longer period of time? More on that as we go. So you've seen this before. This is just grounding us in what the budget looks like today. The general fund's a little over $1 billion. We just surpassed that with the current budget we're in. We're going to talk a little bit in a minute about property tax and sales tax. Those are the two largest revenue sources. We're going to telegraph a little bit what it looks like for the upcoming year. And then we'll talk about some of the assumptions we're using as we think about expenditures as well. So again, here's just looking at the revenue. Property tax and sales tax make up over 80% of all the revenues in the general fund. That's why we spend a lot of time thinking about property tax revenue and sales tax. You've seen this before. It's the current tax rate. Overall, it's 67.25. We break that down into O&M and the debt. O&M is 52.5. Pay-as-you-go is currently 7 cents, and then the debt service is 14.75. You've seen this chart before, and it's just a show over time. And Mayor, when you think about it over a period of history, the goal back in 2015 was to get to that we wanted the tax rate to be about 30%. The debt and pay-as-you-go is of the total tax rate about 30%. We're now at 32. So now it's time to think about, do we need a new goal there? And then the cash portion of the capital program, we wanted that to be 30% of the total capital program. And I'll have you think about just that for a minute. You don't want to pay for your capital projects entirely with a credit card. That's debt. It's okay to have some of your capital program paid for by a credit card or debt, but you don't want to be completely leveraged, because if you do head into a recession, you then don't have the ability to pay for your credit card. Does that make sense? So we want a portion of our capital plan to be cash funded. That's the pay-as-you-go. And I'm with you if you want to increase the amount of cash that we put into the capital program, because that also becomes your flexibility in a downturn, right? That you're able to have more cash. You can't take on the debt. It's really not different than a household, right? If we hit hard times, it's good to not have most of our revenues tied up in paying for debt, and to have more of the revenues that are flexible in that vein. So I think it's up to us to decide from here, how do we want to invest the tax rate? Should more of it be cash, more of it go to capital? And all of that is what balances and gets us to this 67.25 tax rate. So we make some assumptions as we look about the upcoming year, and when we do projections for our debt financing and bond programs. So we're estimating a pretty conservative 4% property tax revenue growth, a 4% sales tax growth, and then we've bounced around on these other revenues, but the majority of our attention, again, is on property and sales tax. You've seen this slide. Also, this is going back over a longer period of time. Fort Worth used to have a property tax rate that was near $1. I want you to think about that. Near $1. And the only way you can reduce the tax rate if you're not going to cut services is you need to grow in order to reduce the tax rate. Does that make sense? And so we have had, if you want to just look at the last 10 years, we've had some pretty incredible growth in assessed values that has allowed us to reduce the tax rate. We used to have the largest tax rate of any major city in Texas. And I remember when I started here, the council's direction was, we don't want to be the city with the highest tax rate in the state. Now, you still have to deliver services, you still have to deliver infrastructure, but the goal was to reduce the tax rate so that we weren't the highest tax rate of any city in Texas. So here's what that growth has looked like over the past few years. Going back to 2018, you got the tax rate on the far left column. The new growth is is the new development that was produced each year. And I'm going to take a minute here. Remember, now in the state of Texas, we can capture all the new growth, right? You get to keep all that. But the state law in Texas says of the existing growth, you can only have 3.5, right? And you're supposed to then reduce the tax rate so you only capture the 3.5. Everybody remember that? And so if you look at 2021, this is COVID. It was the year that there was really no increase in existing values of property in the city of Fort Worth, and so that was less than 1%. The state also says you can capture an increment. So when we hear us talk about an increment, you can capture the percentage when it wasn't 3.5%. And in our last year's budget conversation, when we talked about last year's tax rate and the tax rate that's on the table for the upcoming year, we still have this increment that is available for us to capture as part of the conversation in the upcoming budget.
Remind me how much that increment is, David?
About 3 cents.
Thank you.
So I'll take a minute if I can do this. So we talk about no new revenue. A no new revenue tax rate assumes that we will collect all the new growth and nothing else. Right? We're going to collect zero of the existing growth. The voter approved tax rate says you can take all the new growth, 3.5% of the existing growth, and the increment without triggering a voter requirement to approve a tax rate. So we'll get back into that conversation. No new revenue rate is only capturing the new growth. Voter approved rate is new growth, 3.5% plus the increment. These were in the newspaper last week about assessed values, and I'll tell you, staff is excited to have Councilmember Blaylock on the Tarrant Appraisal District too. Because I do think it is important to be able to explain when you read these articles that are in the paper that values are declining, right? And then somebody gets a bill that's either the same or more, right? And so that explanation of what's happening with home values, what's happening with commercial values or new development will be an issue as we go into the upcoming year, and these are just from last week. Just to remind the council, we will get the first numbers from the appraisal districts at the end of March. So our first shot at what we believe the values will look like for the upcoming fiscal year, we'll have at the end of March. Again, this is just showing in the current fiscal year that new construction was about 3.2%, and all the other values went up 12, a little over 12. Just a second on this chart. The green line is the net taxable value over time. The orange shape is showing what is happening to existing growth. And then the blue is what new growth looks like. So most of the growth in the tax base that we've seen over the last number of years is what has happened to existing values, not new growth, but existing values. Existing values are what have created most of that growth over that period of time. And I think that earlier slide also supports that. When we talk about assessed values and exemptions, again, in this case, the orange is the net taxable value. The blue values are the exemption amounts. And we increase the 65 and older disabled exemption in the current year. I'm trying to see if there's a slide where we get to talk about that again. It's coming. All right. One more look at the tax base too. is the divergence of residential and commercial are not good trends. And when you look at now, and in this calculation, multifamily is included in the residential line. Okay, so it's not in commercial, it's in the residential line. And what has happened when you look at new development, the new development looks pretty balanced. There's commercial in new development, there's residential in new development, and it's balanced. What is happening is the appreciation in existing values is growing at a faster rate for residential than it grows for commercial. When you look at existing values, so it's already on the ground, residential values are growing at a much faster rate than commercial values. There's a lot of theories out there on why that is true, but that is what's creating the divergence of residential from commercial, not as much of new development.
And I think that's very important that Elizabeth has a question, because each of you probably get this comment. You hear the tax base is upside down. And to some extent, that's actually not true, because we can't control the way residential property tax values are assessed or the way they're able to be protested. And each of you probably hear a lot about that. And arguably on the commercial side, there's a more sophisticated element to how commercial property owners protest their values and keep them held lower, which this is speculation across the state, but you hear that a lot about how residential homeowners are, for whatever reason, not as successful or don't take advantage of the protest process is probably the best way to put it. There's a great process in place. Tad does a great job of that now, or trying to. So just know that's the case. And then Elizabeth, and then I'll go to Alan.
David, my question is, because we do hear that a lot about the flip in the tax base. And we get compared to other cities. And so I guess this is the first time that I realized that we included multifamily in that residential component. Do other cities put that, right? Are we hurting ourselves by putting this number out and putting multifamily in with the residential? Because when I think residential, I think single-family homes, duplexes. Multifamily is definitely a place where people live, but don't we tax that as a commercial entity as well?
So TAD does include apartments above fourplexes, I believe this is right, as commercial property.
Do we?
But no, from a city economic standpoint, we view multifamily because we're providing mostly residential services to multifamily.
Okay.
So from a cost side, we treat multifamily like we would treat residential.
And so by residential services, we're talking about like water, police,
Fire, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
If we took that and said, we're going to do this analysis in the same way that TAD classifies as, so commercial, multifamily going into commercial, can we get what that number would
Yeah,
look like?
I think there's a way to back that out because we get it in different formats.
And I get why we're doing it, and that makes total sense from a policy perspective. I'm just curious to know what that would look like, because I think that's a very good talking point for us when we get hit with that is, well, let's talk about how we classify this as residential because of the services. I would argue that our commercial services require police and fire and water as well. But
They do.
I think that would help us have a better, more informed conversation with our constituents.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Alan?
So, David, this is a topic we've talked about a few times, and how to really get a handle on it seems to be quite challenging. What I would like to know is, aside from the actual that we have here, is there another way to really metricize? Because I know we've had significant growth to our commercial base over these 25 years. Has it truly been outstripped by our residential, or is it strictly evaluation? Is there another way we can look at this where we can get a better idea of what the real mix should be?
More the volume mix is what you're wanting to
Sure.
see rather than the values? Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
just to understand if it truly is a misevaluation from a TAD perspective, or if there's something else going on.
And I think not that we haven't tasked the budget office or the Fort Worth lab with stuff, but that is one of the evaluations to look at is, let's take residential property over time, let's take the commercial property over time and put it side by side in a real assessment of what's happening year to year on values.
Gina?
David, I have a question that finds me rather conflicted. When I hear TAD considers multifamily as commercial, but we consider it as residential, it brings to mind one of my developers who is running into this conflict. And if the city looked at multifamily as commercial, as the original documents in this development do, and you know who I'm talking about,
I do.
I am concerned because it looks like maybe we have a developer who is being treated unfairly. But can you repeat for me again how cities view this? And it may be, maybe Fort Worth is on the cutting edge, you know, considering multifamily as residential and not commercial. But, you know, I would like to know how many cities across the state hold the Fort Worth view, not looking at multifamily as commercial, because I understand that that is a trend. And so can you elaborate on that, or is that some research to come?
Well, I think we could do some research on that. And I'm just speaking of the local governments that I've worked in, multifamily's always been considered residential. And when we talk about recruiting businesses to come to the city of Fort Worth, what we're trying to bring is commercial tax base that is providing jobs. So when we think about economic development, it's about businesses, it's about jobs, and I'll get more into that as we talk about fiscal health. And so in the case of, when we talk about economic development, we don't need to recruit multifamily, right? There's no reason to recruit multifamily. Multifamily's happening all over the place on its own. You see what I mean? And when we're talking about incentives, we're really talking about how are we attracting higher paying jobs that put large amounts of assessed value on the ground. And when we do that, that actually helps us pay for all the services that we provide everybody in the city of Fort Worth. And so I think there's a general understanding that commercial, industrial, actually pays for all the services that we get to provide to all the people that live in Fort Worth.
And you won't find me disagreeing with that, but I didn't have the intellectual depth to know how to ask this next question. What I would like to see, and this is not critical or anything, but I would like to know what other cities, populations, say 750 and above, view multifamily as we do in Fort Worth.
Yeah.
And the idea is if we are creating a situation where developers who have these old contracts are being penalized because of the way we view, then that's another conversation. But I'd like to see population 750 and above to see, you know, who views it like we do. And I know it's a trend growing, but I just want to know so that I can help developers.
Okay. Now jumping to our first shot at property tax for fiscal year '25. This is just talking about different projection scenarios. And I want to hit some of the footnotes too. But if you look at, there are 4 growth scenarios, 3, 5, and 8, nothing magic, just giving you different ideas, what the taxable assessed value would look like if we calculated a no new revenue rate off of that number based on some assumptions. So this is just to give you some flavor as we talk about the upcoming budget in the next number of months. Now we have some footnotes here because there's been talk about, do we want to increase the exemption again for 65 and older, right? That was the equivalent in the current year of about 0.5 cent on the tax rate, if you remember. There's also the child care credit for facilities, child care facilities. And we've done the assessment, and that's worth about 1 million at 100% exemption, right, which is available for child care facilities with the recent passage of state law. Both of those, city council would have to take action in the June timeframe, right? So we don't have to decide anything today. But if we want to increase the exemption, let's say we went from 40 to 60, if we wanted to go from 60 to 80, right, we'll bring back that number. Again, the current year's number was worth about 0.5 cents on the tax rate. And the child care facility credit is worth about $1 million that we would be allowing to occur in the upcoming year. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Both would have to be done in June. This gives you just a graphic and giving you some of our averages over the past number of years. And when you think about the last, let's say, 7 years, that's been a strong, just over 7% annual growth, right? So we have been writing pretty good property tax revenue or assessed value increases over that period of time. Sales tax. Again, we're showing you what 3 projections could look like. Sales tax has been incredibly strong. It actually, if you look at 2020, that was the year of COVID, and it flattened that year. If you were here during COVID, we expected like a 20% decline in sales tax during that year. You know, we put into place a hiring freeze, and then we ended the year taking in a little more money on sales tax. So again, I think we were fortunate during COVID that we didn't really decline in sales tax. We didn't really decline in property tax revenue. But this year we're seeing a little slowdown in the the sales tax. We've made some projections. In the budget is $250 million. We're now looking at that range being somewhere between 235 and 252, depending on some of the assumptions that we make. But again, strong growth over the last number of years. Here's what that looks like over time, and again, in a graphic way. 7-year average of just under 8%. Again, strong growth on sales tax. This just shows you again what on the expenditure side, what the budgets look like. Again, matching the revenues from an earlier slide. We make some assumptions going into the upcoming fiscal year. We're in the last year of our final meet and confer agreement. We're starting new meet and confer agreements that'll take place starting October 1st. We're in, I think, the second year of the collective bargaining agreement with fire. The reason that says 3% is that agreement, I believe, was front-loaded. So it had a 5% increase. Overall, it's an average of 4%. We also include 4% pay for performance for other employees, group health, estimated increase of 5%. 4% pay-as-you-go increase is tied to the tax base increase. And then we look at prior commitments and implementing the bond projects that will then bring operating costs in the year that we finish those. Usually when we match the expenditures based on those assumptions with the earlier assumptions you saw on revenues. Usually the expenditures outpace the revenues, so we're always into then figuring out how we manage the budget in the upcoming year. Here are some considerations for the upcoming budget on the revenue side. We do believe the tax base is going to grow. What that looks like yet, it's yet to be seen. If we want to consider increases in the exemption and increases or doing the exemption for child care centers, again, that has to be done by June. We're going to talk again next week about whether we want to consider a street maintenance fee. Again, we implemented a stormwater utility fee increase of 15% in the current year. And then we always talk about the water and sewer fund each year and what rates need to be to manage that. On the expenditure side, here's where we threw in parks and green space, Mayor. Also homelessness, environmental programs. We're not just wrestling with the general fund, but we'll have Will Rogers Convention Center expansion conversations, the EMS ad hoc committee, 911 consolidation, meet and confer, and again, evaluation of the recent fire staffing and overtime. You've seen that. Investment in transportation infrastructure and maintenance, the conversation about pay-as-you-go. Cast iron pipe replacement, which has been a priority for the water department. I know the priority of this council too. Coming out of the winter ice storm of 2021, we knew we need to accelerate the replacement of cast iron pipe. And so we can talk about where we are with that. We'll also be bringing to you how are we going to handle some of the capital projects that are going to have cost overruns. We'll do that this spring as well. And then, yes, we want to be competitive in salaries and benefits. And I just wanted to take a minute to talk,
Carlos, did you have a question before he keeps going?
Just a question, David. I think it's probably included in your mind in that bullet point, but when we talk about cast iron pipe replacement and all, trying to accelerate that pace, does that also take into account the 50-50 proposition when it comes between TPW and the water department? Because we don't want to get that funding gap too big.
yes, and I want to, both departments try to complement each other. So if we're going to do a road project, we want to know if water's going to come in later and tear it up to do something with cast iron pipe, because we want to replace the cast iron pipe and then do the road. So there is a lot of coordination, both whether it's initiated by water or initiated by TPW to coordinate those, so we only tear up the road one time.
Jared, go ahead.
Yes, thanks, David. On that last slide, can you just share a little bit more on the study on market competitiveness of salaries?
So we do that each year. We take groups of positions and do market salaries, and we include public and private sector. Deanna is here, she can get into more detail about it. But our goal is to be competitive in the marketplace. And we collect, again, like I said, data that is both public and private sector and see where we stand. And if we need to adjust certain positions, they're adjusted as part of the budget. If we need to move ranges of a group of positions, we do that too.
That makes sense, thank you. And just kind of touching back on the earlier conversation, I think some of the challenges with the market study is, especially for some of our jobs, the wages are so low that folks that work in our city can't live in our city. I mean, so the study may say that other jobs are also paying low as well, but it wouldn't justify moving those wages to ensure that our residents can live in the city and our employees can live in the city. So I just want to put that caveat on that market study that I think we're going to have to, which is why I've requested it in a past work session, but I think we're going to have to look at where does that base need to be for city employees to live in the city of Fort Worth, and then do an adjustment to the bands across the entire, all of our job classifications.
Any other questions? Keep going, David, you're good.
All right. So this last part, when we think about fiscal health, I'm going to try to stretch us to think about how we think about how healthy we are, not just today, but if there's somebody sitting around this table 20 years from now, right? Or 40 years from now. Because I do think it's our responsibility to make sure we're doing the right decisions for the long-term health of the city. And I got a couple ways to do it. So one is when we think about debt. And Reggie's going to be coming to us this spring with our debt program for fiscal year 24, and 25. And we are gonna go into debt, right, of whatever he brings us for the next 20 or 30 years, right? So when we think about water pipes, water line, I got 30, right? Okay. It's for a long time. When we talk about roads or parks, it's 20 years. And we spend a lot of time going into projections of, can we sell this debt and pay it off under the assumptions for the next 20 years? Right, so we want to be conservative on the projections so that a future city council sitting around is not trying to figure out how to pay that debt off that had already been incurred. Right, so that's what we're trying to do. So we've got long-term projections. Reggie's going to be coming to you to talk about what it looks like for the upcoming year and the next bond program. Reggie, have you already said that number? I announced it. It's about 800 million, right? So when we think about the next bond program, it's too late now, Reggie. Right? About 800 million when we think about the next bond program, which will be in 2026. Now, a lot goes into that, but it's a commitment that we have the ability to repay it. And when we meet with the rating agencies, they look at us, and what I like about rating agencies, I take it back. You don't always like meeting with rating agencies because sometimes you think they're too rigid on stuff. Sometimes you think they're not flexible. But it is an independent, objective assessment of our fiscal health, right? And when you look at where we stand with the different rating agencies, it's highlighted in yellow there. So I like Kroll the best. Just kidding, they'd give us the highest ratings. But if you look at Fitch and S&P, both AA, and Moody's has us at a AA3, right? And when we ask them, each of those rating agencies, what are our strengths and what are our challenges? And so I wanted to share a couple of those as we talk about, again, the assessment from an independent, objective third party. So when you look at our strengths on this slide, we're a growing economy, that's good. We've got strong reserves, and I want to thank the city council for, we need to grow the fund balance. We've been able to do that over time. On our challenges, there's a couple things out there that I want to hit. This is Moody's scorecard. And the economy in that top category, if you look across, we get a lower grade in resident income, right? So the highest rating we can get from Moody's standpoint is a single A in that category. And unless we increase the income of the community, per capita incomes, over time, it'll never get higher. Does that make sense?
Yes.
If you look at our per capita assessed value, right, our total assessed value divided by the population, we can only get a AA based on how we compare with other cities. And so when we look at, are we getting better over time, two of the measures that we use are our per capita incomes increasing over time? And is our assessed value per capita increasing over time? Faster than inflation. Does that make sense? That, from a rating agency standpoint, that's how they view our ability to repay debt. Are we getting more prosperous over time to be able to pay our debts? Where we really struggle with some of the rating agencies is on the pension side and our fixed costs, right? So if you look at that fixed fixed cost ratio of almost 20%. So of 20 cents on every dollar in our budget is to pay for the pension or debt service. Does that make sense? And the higher that percentage, the rating agencies look at you as you're getting burdened with more and more fixed costs over time. And if something happens to your revenue, that really is a problem because you got to pay the pension, you got to pay the debt service, that's first dollars out, and it reduces your flexibility with the rest of the money that we have. Yes.
On the, so on that 20 cents, between those two, how do those two break out?
Debt service is not really a problem. If you look at our debt, it's more of the pension liability over time.
Okay, you said it's like a 70-30 split there, or 80-20, or? do you-
I'll get the exact numbers for you.
Thanks.
And we'll bring that when we do the debt plan that'll be coming this spring.
Okay, thanks.
So this is why we focus on economic development and attracting assessed value and attracting high-paying jobs, because it'll move both of those lines. This is per capita property value growth adjusted to $2,000. The good news is these lines are going up, right? That's the direction we want it to go. That's not guaranteed, and you've seen over time that it's been flat or even has gone down a time or two. And here's per capita income growth. The blue line is in real terms, and the orange line is adjusted for inflation, and that line hadn't moved much.
Can you do me a favor and go back the slide, one slide before? Okay, so I guess what happened in 2010? Because
That was the real estate recession of 08, 09,
Okay.
I think, impacting assessed values.
Okay, and so, but, and we don't, do we ever anticipate that line growing closer together like it did pre? No. Mark was a resounding
He
no.
said no.
For those of y'all that couldn't hear him behind me.
Okay,
It has a lot to do with the exemptions that you're offering.
okay, great. Thank you.
And so we, again, back to economic development, that's why I believe economic development is so important, attracting the higher paying jobs, bringing in the assessed value, because it allows both those lines to increase. And from a rating agency standpoint, in their eyes, it improves our ability to repay our debts and cover our fixed costs. Now, I'm going to end with this. These are the top 20 cities in 1960. I picked 1960, that was the year I was born, but to give what happens to cities over a period of time, take a look at those 20. 10 of them are gone, are not in the top 20 anymore. That includes Detroit, Baltimore, Cleveland, Washington, D.C., St. Louis, Milwaukee, Boston, New Orleans, Pittsburgh, and Buffalo. And the question is, what happened to those cities over that period of time? Detroit at one time was one of the richest cities, was the fourth largest, had 1.6 million people. Now has less than, somewhere around 600,000, 1 million people left. Just think about it. This is the top 20 now. Fort Worth shows is number 13, but in parentheses are where they were in 1960. There's a projection I recently saw, I did show the mayor, which takes the 22 US Census and grows it by the rates recent rates of those cities, and for a 24 estimate has Fort Worth at number 11, right? And San Jose's falling because it's actually declining in population. But if you look at these differences from that time to today, if you look at per capita incomes, they declined over time. So as people left, the per capita incomes of those cities actually declined over time. Some of the assessed values declined over time. Right? As people leave, it's hard to push up values of property when people are leaving. And so I think our interest is to keep an eye on the ball, and that's, are we creating the environment that people want to move here, that are bringing the jobs and the assessed value that can pay for the services, the infrastructure over a long period of time. So this is just from a book. Prosperity is not guaranteed, and it's all of our responsibility to make sure we do what's necessary over time so that somebody, I'd say a council sitting around this table 20 years from now gets to say the same thing that we're saying today. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you, David. Questions, comments from council? No? You're sufficiently asleep. Are you awake? Macy, please.
I feel like someone has to comment on this. This slide, the property tax base slide, I think is the most telling, and that's kind of, I think should be the basis of our conversation, the majority of it today. The residential, I mean, the line is, those are the users, and I think that's the deficit is the infrastructure that we have. I think that's what everybody's complained about, right? We have all these new rooftops and not enough roads to service emergency services getting there, and we don't have the commercial base to pay for those roads. So I think that's really important that we keep the eye on the ball on that. But this kind of sums up where we are right now as far as priorities. At least that's my perspective.
Anyone else, council? Okay, thank you, David, very much. Next is Hillary's going to lead us through council vision and values.
Hello, everyone. We are here again. So many of you went through this process last year, really trying to establish what the strategic priorities of Fort Worth would be. And I've got some new faces at the table, and I had the chance to speak with you all ahead of this to get your personal perspectives. But I think it's important as we move through today in refining what our strategic priorities are and establishing our values and vision statements is to kind of take a moment to look at what we've talked about already. So clearly, you now have a more specific financial picture in your mind of where we stand as a city. You've also looked at where we have accomplished what we thought we would or what we thought we should over the last year, and found areas where we think we need to spend more effort. And so that's really what this process is going to be about, is we kind of put the nuts and bolts together last year of what the strategic priorities should be. We started feeling through how we could measure those, how we could attach them to internal processes. But now is where we really need to layer it into all of our thinking, all of our systems, so that we can appropriately measure over time to see if where we say we're headed is where we're headed, and if we can afford to get where we want to go, and all of the things we've talked about. So, here we go. Okay, so the first thing I want to start with is just kind of this concept that last year we focused on the middle section, the map part, which was we established our priorities, and then staff came and worked with you independently to put together some goals. And we'll look at those again. And in my pre-interviews with you, most of you said that you still thought that that was relevant, that you thought that your district priorities would fit within any of those categories. But we want to look at them one more time before we give staff their orders to kind of carry out and march with what you've said. But today, I also think we need to start layering in the overarching thoughts, sentiments, beliefs of this body. And so in my pre-interviews with you, I asked you about, what kind of vision statements you thought should be the overarching desire of Fort Worth. Where do we want to head? What is our aspiration as a city? But then also, are there those non-negotiables, those values that should be embedded in every single thing, all the things we've talked about today, but also in everything that the staff brings forward to you related to any type of action that you're expected to take, any kind of decision that you're expected to make, but also in embedding them in the strategic priorities so that we ensure that, that value is a given. You don't have to question, you don't have to add it in. It is part of the formula that gets to your desk in the first place. So we're gonna start there with the vision and values, and this is, please give me your input. I have put together a consolidated report of what you said to me ahead of this, but I think now is where we need to hone in on what those really high-level thoughts are that we share as a body, that we expect the organization to carry out in our work. So just in review, a vision, it's why we do what we do. It's our collective aspiration. It's sort of the guiding light. It's the where we're headed or what we're trying to become. And it's intended to be the motivation or inspiration for whatever it is that we're doing or trying to push forward. Values are the how we make our decisions, how we care for people, what our organizational culture should be, and back to that non-negotiables thought. What are those things that we should never violate and we should always incorporate? So in speaking with you independently, these were some of the vision words that came out of those conversations. And where I'm not expecting us to put a vision statement together today, what I do want us to work through is what of these are the highest level or the highest order that you would want included should a vision statement sort of be crafted after this session for you all to consider. But those vision thoughts were that we are visionary, that we are stewards guiding our city into the next phase, that we're a city of opportunity, that equity is important across districts, across the large landmass that is Fort Worth, that we make deliberate decisions that are fiscally responsible. We focus on continuous improvement, never being satisfied with where we are. We have a strong identity that is special, unique, and I think Elizabeth's word was magic. What was that? Yeah. That there's a magic here. There's something special about Fort Worth. That people can feel or that we should capture, that we're focused on people. We desire a high quality of life. We want all of our decisions to be livable decisions, not things that are meant to inhibit livability. We value strong neighborhoods. We want people to have access to amenities, that connectedness is important, community engagement is important, and partnerships are important. And so I guess from my perspective and from the group's perspective, which of those rise to the top of your list? What do you think is the most important for the long-term success, vision, movement of Fort Worth? Yes? Jared said yes. All, right?
The mic or not. And I'd say a lot of it is tied back to that quality of life, because none of it matters if there's a low quality of life, right? So
well, you get the prize today because we had an overarching sentiment last year when we built our program, our strategic priorities that said quality of life. We didn't define it specifically. And so I think you're right on target with what is it that delivers on that promise.
Is the question, what else is on this list that we find to be most important?
Yes.
Along a vision? Okay. Gina?
Or it could not be on this list, and there may be something you've thought of since.
Strong neighborhoods for me.
Macy?
I think the fiscally responsible comment, I mean, none of this can happen if we're not fiscally responsible.
Elizabeth?
For me, it's deliberate decisions, that whatever decision we make, we do so with a clear sense of purpose and future.
Anyone else? Alan?
So not on this list, but I think important, and we talked about it a lot last year, is a safe city.
Anyone else? Jeanette?
So it's community engagement for me.
Engagement, okay. Okay. Okay, so from here, we want to talk about values. So vision, where are we headed? And clearly it is still, it's quality of life and trying to define that in a more meaningful way. And I think we can use some of these high-level concepts that you all have offered to create something that is more of a definition, more of a vision statement related to quality of life, which is what all of the strategic priorities support. So next, let's move to our non-negotiables or values. And so these were, I've grouped like sentiments together, but these are the things that came out of our pre-interviews as well. And so I'll just go through. So the first block is sort of the visionary, innovative, forward-thinking, or bold decision-making concept. Then we move into equity, equitable access, and opportunity. Then we move to the fiscal responsibility, pragmatic, and stewardship, and then safety and security, livable, people-focused, compassionate, respect, empathy, friendly, collaboration, partnership, community engagement, communication, and then honesty, transparency, accessible, trust, integrity, accountability, predictability, deliberate, and decisive. And so if you were to say, I'm going to pick, I don't know, 5 of these and put them on my list of we will always consider these factors every single time we ask staff to do something, every single decision we make should incorporate these in some way, or this should be the foundation of those. What words rise to that level?
I would say transparency and fiscal responsibility.
Elizabeth said stewardship. What'd you say, Jeanette? Communication.
I'm going to say equitable access, and I want to also add that to the other slide when Elizabeth talked about deliberate in decisions. Make sure we really hound in on equability.
Okay.
Whatever, I make up words, okay?
I'm following.
She know what I meant.
You missed
Thank
our
you.
joke earlier. You weren't here.
Did I miss?
Yeah, the presentation on fiscal health, and I said not physical health. And you weren't even here for it. It's so disappointing.
Hillary, can we put
Yes.
an asterisk next to all of these? I mean,
Yeah.
we can have all these values and a great list, but if we don't do it with excellence, it's not worth doing. And I think
Okay.
that's something that we need to have in parentheses or an asterisk, that no matter which ones we choose, it has to be executed with excellence.
Okay.
Are you ultimately going to make us write a mission statement or no?
Not today.
Okay, I just was making sure I was anticipating the forced trust fall that was going to happen. If
Yeah.
we're not going to do that,
Yeah, no.
then I feel better.
It will come back at some
Okay,
point,
good.
but I wasn't going to make it,
I'm
not
gonna-
today's
I'm not going
timeline.
to pull a fire alarm. Okay, good.
No. No, just trying to hone in on what's the most important to you all.
No, it's very helpful. Yeah.
Okay.
And I
Okay.
think along this, to agree with Macy, and Charlie already noted it, the integrity piece, how do you do something with excellence, with integrity, every decision that you make? People focus is on here, but that should just be a given when you're in city government. Every decision you make is for the residents that live here. But these are grouped well together. How do you depoliticize the term equity in a way that makes sense to people? This is just about making sure that every resident in the city of Fort Worth has the services that they need to be successful, and it's just that simple. So I'm not going to be eloquent enough today to explain that to people, but it's about putting our resources where they're needed most.
Right.
And we've done a great job with that. We have a wonderful rubric in our neighborhood improvement program, just one area in particular. If you're data focused, that's where the money will go, right? If you're focused on utilizing that, and every department's doing that. So just thinking about that throughout our values discussion as well is important.
Anybody else? Okay. All right, y'all have you've given me my nuts and bolts that I need. Okay, so let's review back where we were last year. So now we've sort of got vision and values concepts and the map, if you will, the priorities and goals that we worked on last year. We're going to go through that. But, back to this, some of you, this is a new concept because you weren't here last year, but the strategic visioning loop is basically that council is taking input from citizens and staff and envisioning what the future of Fort Worth should be, and then handing it to staff to actually create the action plan. And so part of that is a budget, part of that is a CIP plan, part of that is all of these policy decisions that you all will make, and that's where council affirmation comes in. Once those decisions are made, once they're affirmed, then staff now knows to carry forward. And then part of today with staff coming back to you and saying, this is what you said were your priorities last year, this is what we've accomplished related to those, and we will refine that process moving forward. So that you can tell them, yes, it met the mark, or no, it didn't, and staff can adjust and we can start this whole cycle again. So again, we're at this sort of higher level envisioning where we're going, not necessarily nuts and bolts, but we do want to have a discussion about where the district-specific priorities fit into the overarching process.
Where's the loop piece where Gina blows it up along the way? Makes staff reevaluate everything.
That's
and
right.
Come back to the loop.
We'll add it. We'll add it.
It's what? Council envisions is right there.
Council envisions.
She gets a little offshoot there. Yeah, right. I forgot. Sweet little old lady. Go back to that quote. Yeah.
So this is where we landed last year, was we had this overarching desire, which is that sort of vision piece that we're going to flesh out moving forward. With these three buckets or columns, if you will, that supported that concept. And it was economic development and community investment, community safety, infrastructure, responsible growth and financial responsibility. And so as you saw in the report earlier, we sort of broke those out because they're pretty broad areas. And so today what we want to consider is whether we can break those out a little bit further so that they can be better tracked and monitored, and we can start applying key performance indicators and all of the data-driven approaches that the lab will be working through. And then we're also going to move into priorities-based budgeting, and we'll have that discussion after this one. But let's just start where we finished last year, which was this. And, this is really small, my apologies. But just kind of where we were then, we did a quick SWOT analysis, and I asked the new members this year to give me their perspectives. But basically, we kind of captured that the strengths that the group saw last year and then added to this year was being accessible to the public, good amenities, bright minds, development process improvements that had been made, fiscal health, which we just talked about, generational interests, landmark institutions, public-private partnerships, strong city identity, sense of community. The council works well together in a civil way, that the city is responsive, and that the branding efforts are consistent and are paying dividends. Weaknesses, we moved into budgetary limitations, meaning that there's always limits, you gotta make choices. The development process being slower or maybe less effective or efficient than it could be. Following others rather than charting our own course, lack of communication engagement, lack of trust, need more public sector support, neighborhood disparities, partisanship, prioritization by council, reluctance to modernize, unwillingness to hear opinions of others, awareness of issues or policies, and staffing challenges. So then opportunities is really where the meat of this is, because it sort of informs where we're headed or how far we wish to go. So the ideas were we make bold decisions or can make bold decisions. We are in a growth pattern, and that is a positive. Economic development has been positive. You've got strong educational institutions, innovation, Panther Island, setting clear priorities, which is part of this that we're working through. Unique character of Fort Worth, utilization of city facilities, we could utilize them better or more. Youth engagement, which came up again this year in a couple of my interviews. Infill development, job growth, development input, and addressing housing barriers. So those were all viewed as kind of the areas we might be able to move the needle or make some progress on. And then obviously threats, things like cybersecurity, unmanaged growth, failure to set clear expectations, losing your identity, outside influence, disparity, something terrible happening, just kind of a point in time. Let's think about where we are, where we feel like we are right now, before we start looking at current issues. So these were the things that actually came up in my interviews with you this year as we start looking toward whether our strategic priorities still remain the same, if we break them out, and if they are defined the same. So the current issues were fiscal responsibility, growth and development, maintaining or improving services, public safety, recruiting and retention, infrastructure, aging facilities, homelessness, animal shelters, lighting, green space and parks, seniors, youth engagement, attainable housing, neighborhood revitalization, mixed-use zoning issues, youth gun violence, business development, small business investment, environmental justice, mobility, connectedness, and thoroughfare planning. And so some of these have already come up in today's conversation, and I just wanted that for you to hear what everyone else is saying. If anyone feels like they want to jump in and talk about any of these issues in specific, or if just the snapshot works, I'm good either way. Does anybody need clarification, definition?
No, I think I missed it, but the infrastructure piece, Mayor Pro Tem told me you guys did talk about PAYGO already.
Yes.
Yeah. Beg. We have the same color on, be good. So I just want to just kind of re-emphasize that.
Yeah.
Was that the right word? Thank you.
And so none of these looked out of sorts for anything that I've heard so far today. And they all seem to be common or current issues that should or could be addressed within what we're doing. Do any of these rise to the level of number one on anybody's list?
Attainable housing, affordable housing,
Okay.
citywide, and not concentrated in neighborhoods of poverty is a big focus for me in the next coming up years, actually. Depends on how long I'm here. Michael, how long you plan on being here?
Anyone else want to prioritize any of these on the list?
I'll
ahead,
go
Charlie.
because I scream it from the rooftops, public safety still, because again, we could completely eliminate property taxes, a community center on every block. We could do all the right things, the greenest grass, the nicest parks, but if it's not safe, it doesn't matter. And that's not just from a violence perspective, that's also from a traffic perspective. That's from more permissive environments now, and as we grow, there's more opportunity for, crimes against property, and somebody's car broken into because they left their door unlocked, now they feel less safe. So when we say public safety, it's not always just a lot of folks think, they just think gun violence, for example, and it's more than just that, just feeling safe in your neighborhood. And that's one thing I hear all the time, up north in District 4 is, we're gonna move somewhere else, it's just not as safe. And it's like, well, lock your doors, that'd be fine. However, that doesn't mean someone's still not gonna walk by. So from the smallest to the biggest, to gun violence, to actual murder, it's the broad gambit. So if that's not number one, and that's not continually addressed, then it can easily get away from us like we've seen other big cities, and then none of it will matter. We can't bring people back and say, oh, look, we're safer now, or look, taxes are lower, or everything else. So that's always my number one issue.
Anyone else? Keep going, Hillary.
I'll
go ahead, Jared.
add maybe one more, and it may fall under aging facilities, but not necessarily. And as we deal with the EMS kind of work out of the ad hoc committee, facilities may need to be revisited based on the outcome of that work. And then with aging facilities, although it's not in my district, it's in Councilmember Begg's, but community centers is always something that's important. I know Southwest Community Center hasn't been improved in a while, and so things like that I think we should consider also when we talk about aging facilities, especially our libraries and our community centers. They're important to the neighborhoods.
Thank you, Jared. Anyone else? Nope. Thank you, Hillary. Oh, Jeanette, sorry.
Sorry, I'm not saying mental health up there. I think that should be something else.
Okay. Okay.
That should be included.
Okay. Okay. So all of this to really get us to this next point, which is let's look at our strategic priorities again and the definitions of those, and then let's consider whether or not breaking them out in a different way makes sense. And then we need to talk about how we make sure that what our priorities are represented, as well as how we insert district level priorities in the process. So again, this is where we were. The overarching quality of life vision with the 3 buckets. And this is how they were defined. I went through these in our pre-interviews and didn't receive any real specific feedback about changing them. Most everyone said that they felt that any of their priorities or needs or district objectives would fit within these parameters. So economic development covered everything from neighborhoods to job development, affordable housing, community cultural assets. Does that still look reasonable? Okay.
Yes.
Community safety. Response times. So earlier today, we talked about code enforcement and animal control and those sorts of things maybe fitting within there. There's not a specific call out, but I would assume that that is probably where that belongs. Okay. Any gaps there?
Just based on earlier discussion for the last bullet point, I don't know how to adequately describe it, but around schools and school safety and crosswalks in particular.
I'll build on that, Councilman Blaylock, if you don't mind. I know one thing we have run into is parking requirements vary based on school model. For instance, public charters may not necessarily have bus transportation drop-off and pickup. And in the development services process, I think it's important that we evaluate that so that we can ensure that the traffic flows in front of the school and the parking capacity and circulation also improves safety. I'm particularly concerned with that as it relates to like parents and students walking to school and there not being enough stacking capacity on the side, and just looking at better ways to help our charter schools and all of our schools, frankly, during the development services process to consider the impacts of their transportation plans on site.
Hillary, I think from our conversation earlier, I'm not sure where we want to put it, but any bullet point regarding homelessness efforts,
Okay.
programming, funding, maybe under community safety, I guess, I don't know.
It was under, so it was under economic development, it says ensure affordable housing and address homelessness, but it seems that that may not be the most
I'm
correct
open-minded.
place.
I mean, just as long as
Okay.
it's just
Okay.
something we grapple with continually.
Okay,
I agree. If we could separate them, because I think they're 2 separate issues.
okay,
It could be
yes,
addressed separately.
okay,
Yeah, good point. Not, yeah.
okay. And then we have infrastructure, responsible growth, and fiscal responsibility.
That had to be a firefighter's phone go off. It was.
So this one we had connectivity of communities, maintaining infrastructure and assets, preservation of parks, open space. The reduce and instead of prevent, the suggestion was that that should be mitigate negative impacts of flooding. Provide opportunities for robust public engagement, proactively plan for growth, and enhance stakeholder relationships. So this was kind of that mixed bag of governance kind of related things, as well as financial and infrastructure.
Question for you, Hillary. In
Yes.
each of these categories and all of the goals, that's they're all great with me. I think what they're missing is any sort of metric we're trying to measure them by. And I'm just wondering, where does that document live? And how do we all know what, when we say enhance connectivity of communities, what do we actually mean by that?
You've nailed it. So after last year's work and we kind of came to this common language, this common thinking, that's the next layer. That's the next step, is how do we figure out what the key performance indicators are? How do we figure out, as we start assigning priority-based budgeting, all of those kinds of metrics and things need to be built in, and I know that's what the lab is working on, and so it's actually their suggestion for the next page that I will get to about breaking them out a little bit more specifically so that they can hone in on those data points and track them more intently than what they were able to provide in the report that was given today. So really, it's trying to get much further down that line and see what those key indicators are to see if you're moving the needle. And so some of that is going to be related to how the public feels about it, but some of them may be dollar specific or program specific, how much participation or the percentages of change and that kind of stuff that they'll be working on over the next year after we kind of settle in on this.
Thank you. Gina, did you have something? No? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Macy, please.
I think we need a line about leveraging relationships with the county, other entities that we work with, like TRWD. I think we have such great relationships. We need to make sure that we're continuing to leverage those relationships to get things done.
Works. Okay. Okay. All right, so now let me show you where staff is hoping we can head to some degree. And that is to break those pieces and parts out so that we can be more thorough in the goals established underneath each of them. As you saw, it's kind of like we tried to get to about 7, but some of them were meatier than that. And so this is the suggestion, and then there's another version of it I'll show you here in a second just to see what your thoughts are. But it was that we still have this overarching quality of life, but that we treat economic development separately, community investment, community safety, infrastructure, responsible growth, and financial responsibility as separate pieces to be tracked and measured and for goals to be assigned. Does anybody have any particular feeling about treating it differently for staff to be able to track?
I jumped ahead to your next slide, and I think you nailed it.
Okay, so here's the next slide. Ta-da! And I didn't nail it. It was staff. This was staff's suggestion. But quality of life being the overarching, that's where we're headed. Financial responsibility being the underpinning. Like everything that is done, that's the foundation, is we have to do it with financial responsibility in order to affect change and or progress in economic development, community investment, community safety, infrastructure, and responsible growth. We also talked about that as being a value, and I think it's important that we reiterate that as well. But if we feel that this is a reasonable course of action, I also think that financial responsibility being its own allows you to look at that, at the budget as part of that, as the priority-based budgeting, as fee discussions, like whatever all of those things are, I think makes it a little bit broader and maybe gives you more flexibility.
Thank you, Hillary. Elizabeth.
I'm interested in having a conversation around what our definition of financial responsibility is. Because I think for some people, that's just a blanket lowering the tax rate, right? For me, that means financial responsibility means something very different. And so I would like a clear definition on what that means for us as we're moving forward, if this is the underpinning of all of our decisions.
Anyone else? Keep going.
Okay. All right, so what happens next is, if this is acceptable, we'll break it out in this manner. We'll work through trying to further define the vision of Quality of life. We will work on defining financial responsibility. We'll work on itemizing goals, or not goals, I'm sorry, values, for it to come back to you all to officially adopt. But also what will happen is staff is going to come work with you individually and independently to make sure that your district level priorities can be represented within this document in some way, and that we can work through the process of getting those in some way more integrated into the budgeting process. How do we elevate those things that are really important in your district in a way that is manageable, but is also effective for you and your constituents? So that would be the next piece of this, is to develop those action plans that support the goals, and then also creating those key metrics, those success markers. How do we know if we've moved the needle? How do we know what we're tracking or what we're headed toward in those major categories? And that's something that the lab has already started their work on, but they will be creating in a more robust way for you all to consider in the future, and all leading to priority-based budgeting, which is what we're going to cover next in this session. So I think that is, we already did those. So really, moving forward, what we would expect is, last year we created the document, we talked to you all, we never officially adopted it. And so as part of that affirmation on that loop that I showed you, we need for that to come before this body so that it can be officially adopted. That's a transparency piece as well, but that gives staff the indication that this is what they're to move forward with. And then we will work, staff is working on a way to incorporate those district-specific priorities in whatever the right format is, so that they can be considered in the budget process and in other systems that exist already in the city. And then, of course, they'll have their action items that would fit within those goals and under those priorities, all leading to budget development, priority-based budgeting, and ultimately to the other side of the loop, which is the reporting. So we need to make sure we know what you want, we know what your expectations are, and that we're reporting back to you if we met it or we didn't meet it, and that we're appropriately resourcing the areas that you find priorities for the organization. So y'all have given me what I need. This will come back to you in a more formalized format, and it'll come back to you through your lab most likely. And unless there is anything else, I will get out of your way and we can start on priority-based budgeting, I think is next. Is that right?
Jared.
Just a comment on that last slide. I just want to say that I appreciate that we're initiating the conversation around district-specific priorities, because sometimes in the budgeting process, there are real needs in each one of our districts that I have personally found difficult to navigate the budget process as it has been, in order to deliver things that I know are really important. And it's just, I appreciate it. So thank you for that.
Like, one of the most important parts of this is how do we make this part of every living, breathing thing in the organization? So, staff should be referencing these priorities to you all as you go through the year, but it's also, do our processes reflect what these priorities state that you all have adopted? And so that is part of the moving forward from this too, is really trying to get it meshed within all of the systems of the city rather than having it sit kind of on its own. It needs to become part of the organizational culture and operation.
Any
All
other
right.
questions? Thank you, Hillary.
Thank you.
Okay, our next item is priority-based budgeting, and I think Mark McDaniel is going to kick things off for us.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Good to be with you this afternoon. I'm going to be crisp, so I can hand this off to Chris, and then also Christiane. So I'll introduce Chris, and then Christiane wants to talk about exactly what was just brought up, is how can we talk to you all and get your input about your individual budget priorities before we're well into the budget process. So we have a plan for that. We'd like your feedback on that plan, or if we need to do something differently. But before that, we want to talk to you about priority-based budgeting. So we've been at this now going into our second year, and we want to lay it out for you as far as how it works. And it's really about getting away from that traditional line item budget to focus more on priorities and actionable priorities. So we've hired a group called Resource X, represented by Chris Fabian. Chris's company works with, I think, over some 60 different clients across the U.S. and Canada. And to his credit, his company has just recently been bought out by Tyler Technologies, which is one of the largest ERP firms in the US. So he's very successful at doing this, and he'll talk to you about his experiences in other large cities and smaller. So really excited about what he's going to talk to you about. And then finally, I just want to mention Christiane is going to talk to you about how we can get in front of you in short segments about each department and their priorities early on, and then how we're going to plan to visit with you early on as well. So with that, Chris?
Thank you.
All right, thank you everybody for having me here. My name is Chris Fabian. I'm plugging in a third computer. 2 is not enough for me. But I took some notes during the early presentation that I want to relate to. All right. It is my honor to be in front of you, council and mayor, and your team who we've been working with. This is your second round in priority-based budgeting. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, David, for setting the stage, and thank you to SGR as well. My agenda here in the next half an hour is pretty simple. I want to introduce you to what priority-based budgeting is all about and what the city is embarking on. I've heard all throughout today's retreat about the future, the long-range plan into the future that you're trying to create. And of course, our goal in priority-based budgeting is to ensure that you have the resources aligned to fulfill this great future that everybody is talking about. So we'll have a little bit of priority-based budgeting 101. I'll talk conceptually about why priority-based budgeting is different from other budgeting processes. And I'll also show you some of what the city of Fort Worth has accomplished to date and where we're going in the future of priority-based budgeting. At the end, when I turn it back over to Christiane, I'm sorry, so close. We will talk about where the Fort Worth Lab and the Budget Office is taking this for the rest of this year. As we do kick things off, I wanted to bring up a movement that is taking place in local government. And the movement is called Rethinking Budgeting. And the city of Fort Worth is effectively representing the poster child point of view, if you will, for what rethinking budgeting can be. Rethinking Budgeting is an initiative that is led by the Government Finance Officers Association. That's GFOA, that's where your budget and finance professionals get their continuing education, and the ICMA, which is the International City and County Management Association. Why they are leading the charge on something called Rethinking Budgeting is because the types of challenges that you all have been talking about today during your retreat require something different from our budget. I don't know if you know this, there's a little budget trivia, but the line item approach to budgeting, the traditional approach to budgeting that we all practice, celebrated its 100th birthday around 2020. Line item budgeting has lasted the test of time. It's been the way we budget. So, I like to think sometimes 100 years ago, there was somebody like me talking about this great new innovation called line item budgeting. And you have to wonder, like, what came before that? But line item budgeting has established for us consistency. It allows us to track spending. It's an accountant's dream. But when it comes to fulfilling key priorities like a safer community, like you've talked about, like economic vitality, line item budgeting is perhaps in need of evolution. And that's where we have come in. I practiced in local government myself, and it was working and serving for my elected officials when they had these key questions that we'll get into, that we had to approach the budget in a different way. So what is it that I'm talking about? So here's, I'm going to draw you a picture of this concept first, and then we'll get into it. But line item budgeting, if you're all familiar with line items, looks like describing how much we need for personnel, how much we need for supplies and services. And during the earlier part of your discussion, I not not once did I hear any of you talking about, in order to fulfill our objectives, I really think that we should be talking about our office supplies. Not once did I hear any of you talk about how you need to address the postage line item in your budget. You talked instead about programs. You talked about safety audits. You talked about school crossings, emergency response, resource planning in HR across the board. So you talk programmatically about what you want to do, that's the how, to achieve your results, and yet we budget at the line item level. And so that needs to be improved. So in priority-based budgeting, all we do is we recenter the dialogue on what you're already talking about. What are the programs that you want to provide in order to fulfill the priorities that we're trying to achieve? So we don't escape the line items. It's just that we're adding more nuance. We're coming to understand the line items in your budget in a new light, the programs that they fund and the outcomes, the results, the priorities that you're striving to accomplish. And quite simply, if I ended the presentation today, that's the most important part, is that in your shift, you are connecting line items to programs and connecting programs to priorities, and that gives you new insight into what you are investing in, where you want to invest in the budget process overall. And that, quite simply, is the first of 3 value propositions that I'm going to frame my presentation around for today, which is reframing the budget around your priorities. Quite simply, that's exactly what we're going to do. So when I worked in local government, and you have this kind of picture yourself, I know it's probably hard to read in the back, but this is a line item budget. If you feel yourself getting annoyed as you look at this chart right now, that's the intended outcome. So you're looking at these line items, and this is exactly what a line item budget looks like. And when I was in local government, my elected official, you're laughing, that's not, you're like, you've gone hysterical, losing your minds about the line item budget. But when I was in local government, our elected officials would look at this and say, we just had this retreat, we were talking about priorities, remember that? We're talking about community safety and economic vitality, and the question was, where do I go in the budget to find that? Where do I go, what page can I find out, are we getting safer and more prosperous? Are we investing in economic vitality, community development, infrastructure, everything you've just described? Where do we go in the budget to find out what we're putting into these key outcome areas? And so our endeavor was to simply connect the dots. So what this begins to look like conceptually, this is one of our organizations. They too have key community priorities just like you've described, from a safe community, economic vitality. They have their own specific definitions. And if you look at anyone in particular here, shared prosperity, just like you, they have specific definitions for how that is achieved. But what we want at the end of the day, we talked about transparency overall in our fiscal responsibility approach. We want to be able to see the budget from a results first perspective. And so that's what we have created, is a simple process to do that for this community, for any of those outcomes. And just like you will be able to do what you're working on right now, we can ask, how much are we investing from our operating budget into these key outcome areas that we're trying to achieve? And then what you want to do from there, this is the same budget. This is the exact same budget as your line item budget. It's just seen from a different point of view. It's seen from the priorities that you are trying to accomplish, not necessarily from the line items perspective overall. If we wanted to dive into any of these particular priority areas, we could. And what happens when you do, what do you find? Programs that you're investing in. So priorities are achieved by virtue of the choices you make to fund programs. And so that's our peeling of the onion. And of course, we can see within any given program what the cost is and what the workforce requirements might be. That's the key linkage. And if we wanted to go all the way down specifically to the line item level, we can do that too. So we won't be losing line item information. It's just that we're building the story back up. Line items to programs to priorities, to see the budget from a new perspective overall. And that can help to guide where you're putting your resources.
Go ahead, Macy.
Okay, can I ask a question just for clarification? So is this something we're going to be, y'all are suggesting we start, or is this just a visualization? I can't talk, I'm tired. you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Visual of what you're trying to explain. Thank you. Have Chris speak for me.
I'm sure he'd love to. Careful.
I'll say, you're on your way. Let me address it. You're in the midst of this. You have 3 departments, police, HR, and TPW, who laid the groundwork towards mid to late last year. And now we have a few more departments who are underway. So we're building this perspective for you, which is what we are trying to lay some expectations for what you'll be able to see a little bit later on this year as you engage in the budget process. Is that helpful?
So I guess my question is, whoever codes it, that determines which category it's in. So will we as a council decide what coding is going to be available for the lab, and then someone in the lab will code it for us? Is that the process?
Let me try.
I'm probably too much in the weeds already, but.
You're good. So we're taking, right now, with the departments who are working with us, actually I can show it on a little bit of a roadmap slide here. They create the list of things they do. We call it program inventory. So that's an inventory of programs that they offer and support. They are allocating or associating their line item budget with those programs, so we can find out what it costs them to deliver any of the programs in their budget. And then those programs get aligned with council priorities set by you to come to understand how do these programs actually help deliver the priorities that you just heard about from SGR. And that's why that work is so vital, is coming to understand that. And furthermore, as we get into performance measures, that'll re-emphasize, it will help us test, do programs actually have that cause and effect relationship with priorities that we think they do? So we'll be able to test your hypothesis. You bet.
Just building on that question real quick. What's the timeline for this being implemented citywide? I know it takes time to do it in batches, but what does that look like?
Good question. We're taking it in phases as we go and focusing primarily within general fund departments overall. I think between Mark and Christian and David, we can get back to you on their overall vision for citywide rollout, but we're definitely putting emphasis on the general fund.
That makes sense to me.
Okay, sounds great. All right. So first and foremost, this was the absolutely simple breakthrough, was in order to show to answer those key questions, how much are we investing in our priorities? We wanted to take a line item budget and make better use of it. We couldn't just go line items to priorities. We go line items to programs, which you all get to choose, and then programs to priorities overall. And now we have a pathway. I do want to show you some of your work in the first phase, taking programs, putting cost to them, aligning them with priorities overall. Councilmember, you were just asking what progress. I was showing you a conceptual slide and helping to demonstrate it. But this is what you have done. You took your line items. We're able to see programs here. I'm demonstrating within police department, host of the programs that they offer, TPW included here, and HR. We're the first brave, boldest departments to go through this work. And then we aligned and measured those programs towards your key priorities: economic development, infrastructure, community safety, fiscal responsibility, in addition to other key reasons why you provide programs like degree of mandate, cost recovery, change in demand, population served. So you have a head start, and then we're building on that for this year as we prepare to actually start to share some of this data with you. All right, so the second component, second value proposition I want to get into. So if you think about what I just showed, it's all well and good to see your current budget aligned with programs now associated with priorities. But what happens in this year's budget process as you're getting ready for it? What you're hoping to see are proposals, decision packages, like you normally get a chance to look at those, associated with the programs you provide, tied back to those priorities overall. When I heard the mayor talking about TPW in some of the earlier remarks, the mayor said, TPW, everything you do is community safety. And a lot of what TPW does absolutely impacts community safety, just like it might impact infrastructure, just like it might impact economic vitality. And we've heard the adage that we can certainly associate so many programs you offer with the priorities that you're hoping to achieve. But if everything's associated with a priority, where did we get to? You've heard the adage, if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. So we're trying to find out how can we differentiate? How can we really take a look at all the, David mentioned resources are finite. So trade-offs might be necessary. How do we do that? When you're in the budget blitz, I saw some of these meetings last year, every decision package that moves forward has a great case to make. But how, when you're in your seats, do you say that one proposal is actually more impactful than another? And that's where priority-based budgeting is going to be important in the budget process itself. So just a snapshot, other communities, Mark mentioned, we're working with 60 communities now and 300 in our lifetime. This is Flagstaff, Arizona, and they have key community priorities just like yours. And when it comes time for the budget, we want to see every program that they are offering, every proposal tied to a program. I'm drawing your attention, a very busy slide to that little bar chart with the green on the top. You want to be able to see proposals differentiated one versus another overall. That's going to help you make difficult decisions in the midst of an era where you have tremendous prosperity. You still have finite resources to approve only so many budget proposals, and that's where the prioritization is going to come into play overall. Just as the city of Flagstaff enters their budget request, they can see what is requested by rank and priority. The rank and priority come from those programs that have the greatest degree of influence on the priorities you're trying to accomplish. And over time, you're starting to see that very little is even coming from departments who are requesting lower priority or less aligned budget requests or decision packages. In other words, everything that they're requesting has some degree of priority, but we still need a way to start to differentiate. And that's where the utility of priority-based budgeting comes into play in the budget process itself. So this is where we will head. I want to make mention that for you all, again, with the first 3 phase 1 departments who went through this a little bit last year, so you took your programs, they linked programs to priorities, all of the priorities you're striving to achieve, and then decision packages were linked to every program. What that meant, we had 128 programs identified from police, TPW, and HR. 105 million of decision packages were reviewed and scored across 1,200 different metrics for impact and relevance. As we could start to see only from HR, police, and TPW, this is not citywide, we could start to see the alignment of those decision packages, that's the number of decision packages submitted from these departments, prioritized amongst one another, and begin to see that differentiation. You could start to see the differentiation on decision packages linked to community safety versus those that had the highest impact on economic development and community investment. Ultimately, decision packages with the highest impact on workforce development, some of those from HR, obviously. So with the more departments who are starting to participate, the greater the differentiation that we'll start to see across all of your priorities overall. So this is a great start. Phase 1 was exciting to get underway, get some key concepts. Phase 2, by the time we get back to the budget process this year, starting to see from all of the departments who are participating, I think this will be a lot more interesting to see programs, decision packages now entered into the mix, linked back to the priorities that you were just talking about with SGR. Last but not least, so if you think about the 2 that I've covered, it's one thing to see the budget from a perspective of your priorities, that's great. It's another to be right there in the thick of it when decision packages are being presented and you can differentiate and scrutinize across the highest degree of impact. But ultimately, when David was just going through your fiscal health presentation, as you can see, there's not infinite money. There is only a finite amount of resources. And so priority-based budgeting lends itself well to also offering you an interesting lever in the budget process. And that is looking for areas for resource reallocation. I'll show you, this is one of our communities from the city of Pittsburgh. they have been reallocating resources to the tune of around 10% of their budget overall over the course of last few years towards infrastructure, safety, economic development, and sustainability. They do that by finding program opportunities for sourcing, program efficiencies, service level changes, and revenue enhancement overall. And how they do it is they use the same priority-based budgeting business intelligence to say, and this is kind of fun, what programs lend themselves well to a sourcing discussion? What programs lend themselves well to an efficiency discussion? What programs lend themselves well to a service level change discussion overall? Are they programs that are growing in demand? What about programs that are status quo? What about programs that are actually declining in demand but have a high degree of impact on your priorities? We're trying to set the stage for you all to say, if we frame your program offerings in a certain way, you can engage in a discussion about which programs need resources and where you can reallocate resources overall. It's both on the revenue side. Your city manager mentioned that. It's not just expense reallocation, but looking at revenue solutions as well. But to be sure, where do we have partnerships and sourcing and program efficiency opportunities on the expense side too? I want to bring this to life a little bit. I mentioned Pittsburgh. It's helpful, I think everybody can conceive of a resource reallocation idea, but how does this tie into the program data that you're putting together? So here's a line item, postage in Pittsburgh. I bet we could find out from the Fort Worth lab, the budget office, how much postage is being appropriated throughout the city of Fort Worth. And with the best of our knowledge, we can say from a line item, we can understand which departments are driving a postage budget. That's what Pittsburgh is showing here. So you have the water department, $500,000 of the $1 million postage budget. You have parks with $100,000. You have finance. Those are the main drivers from a departmental perspective. And if you had a hunch that you might be able to save some money on postage, you might say, well, I know the departments that are driving it. I bet we could save money on postage and maybe we could try to cut it by 10%. And if you went directly to these departments, part of the reason I'm belaboring my story right now is hopefully giving you the time to imagine what programs drive the postage budget in the water department. That's what you kind of want to know. You want to know, if I cut postage, I think we can get away with it, but what would I actually be impacting? And the point is, without programs in the mix, we have less visibility on where that postage budget is being allocated. I bet some of you have already been thinking about this, and you would have identified that in the water department, we mail utility bills. That's what drives our postage budget, and that's what's going on in Pittsburgh here. We send out notices. We collect samples for water quality, and we send them back to the lab. Those are programs that require the use of postage to mail and deliver things. And when we have that level of insight, that's when we can get into strategy for resource reallocation. In Pittsburgh's case, looking for paperless options where, to be sure, they had to invest in new technology to go paperless, one-time expense, in order to save on an ongoing basis their ongoing postage budget. You add up all these little solutions, that's how Pittsburgh comes up with 41 million, or close to 10% of their operating budget, to reallocate. Coming full circle back to you all, we want to be able to start to find out across everything you do, what do you offer that offers leverage for your programs? What do you do that's not mandated? What do you do that the demand is going down? What do you offer where it doesn't serve the majority of the population, doesn't align with priorities, or program revenues don't cover the costs of providing those programs? We want to seek out those opportunities too and push for new ways to consider your resource reallocation. So that will be exciting in this approach too. Just as you've gone through the very first foray into phase 1 departments with human resources, police, and TPW, we saw insourcing opportunities, meaning you're a bigger city in a region with smaller entities around. This is blurred out because it's a first round of data. It's not showtime ready, but just to give you a teaser of the kind of opportunities ahead. Perhaps the city of Fort Worth might be an insourcing partner where others are struggling in your region to cover the costs of a program. They could save money by having your organization provide a program, pay you entrepreneurially, the revenues that you generate compared to the small incremental costs to absorb those programs might bring new resources into the organization. We definitely see this when we work with cities of your caliber that are very large, the Kansas Cities, the Denvers, the Seattles, who have these types of opportunities as well. Similarly, on the partnership lens, where do you have programs where they are a high priority, they really rank highly, but there might be opportunities where other entities are providing them? Where can we look for program partnerships? We've seen this work internally as well with larger cities. So it's not just partnerships with external agencies, but where do you have redundancy or overlap within city departments to look for partnerships and centralization? So that's perhaps the third lens overall in priority-based budgeting. We covered reframing your budget around your priorities just so you can see your investment. We covered the second, which is scrutinizing when decision packages are in front of you, how can we differentiate those? And the third is, with all of this data on the programs you provide, how can we frame discussions for resource reallocation and new revenue generation so you have more resources than maybe what you're counting on in the fiscal health projection. So with that, that is the conclusion of my presentation and where we're headed. I did want to pass over to Christiane and certainly entertain any questions or reflections from council.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, Charlie.
So just a quick question. How easy would it be, I don't want to say to manipulate the data, but to manipulate the data? For example, some programs could easily fall into different categories, like say street striping, for example. It's amazing we all want it. But if we want to say, okay, we're concerned about public safety, well, are we going to put it over in infrastructure? Or are we going to go ahead and move it over to public safety just so we can say, hey, look, it's meeting this criteria? So
Yeah, great question. So in the scoring process, I try to stay out of the weeds a little bit, but now I like it because that's what you want to know is like, how do you understand how these programs impact your key priority areas? So programs are evaluated against not one, but all of the priority areas that you might be able to accomplish. What that does for us is we don't have to arbitrarily pick one priority and say, hey, we do street striping or sweeping. That belongs in infrastructure. And you might say, well, that also keeps us safe. And you might say, well, it also might have an impact to the extent that we are adequately planning our traffic flow downtown. It has an impact on economic vitality. So we want to understand the impact that any program has on all of the priorities, and programs that have the greatest degree of impact on all of the reasons why you provide it, your priorities, are by our definition, your highest priority programs overall, as differentiated from programs that have less to do with the evaluation criteria. So they're not mandated, they don't recover their costs, they have less to do with community safety, infrastructure, and so on. That's how we get the ranking. You're diving in.
Anyone else? Questions? Yeah, Carlos.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around, what you said, and a lot of it's partly in the details, like, CM Hill referred to, maybe it's in the coding. But where you have departments that share budget responsibilities on a single priority, okay? How do you distinguish between those budget allocations, towards a single priority and redundancies?
Can you go further in your question? I'm going to get there.
Well, I'm saying, I guess, is the coding sophisticated enough to distinguish between redundancies and shared responsibilities of a priority, a budget priority?
So let me venture, try to get closer to what you're diving into and say, what if we have we talked about homelessness today, right? And in many of our organizations, you might have direct mental health support and resources that might be coming from more of a social or health type of approach. You might have encampment cleanups that is coming more from a public health, but also an economic vitality perspective overall. You might have a public safety element to it as well. So you have multiple departments who are taking a role. I think, hopefully I'm hitting the mark. And that's not redundant. They just have different aspects of contribution towards a similar priority issue, like adequately dealing with homelessness overall. Where we would get excited about, I shouldn't have used the word redundant, but the centralization, decentralization discussion becomes especially exciting in a larger organization because you've grown so much over time. So where we start to see things are maybe there's public information responses that are taking place from every single department. And maybe we just haven't had a chance to take a look at all the programs that each organization, each department is providing and say, we're all doing something similar here. Is there a more combined forces approach that would actually allow us to provide this a little bit more efficiently? My department can stop investing in new resources, free up some people to reallocate towards other high priority needs, and we can come up with a centralized approach. That's the kind of thing that we're looking for.
Okay, I think I can follow that. And then also, I guess that presumes that you would also take into account, say, public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
We rely on partners to help us out, say, in the areas of homelessness.
Yeah.
Where you can quantify those contributions. I mean, again, this proposed system is able to process all that, right?
Yeah, so one of the categories, and I'll wind my way back, and Christiane, I'll get back to your side here right after the thank you. I'm almost there. Okay, so we have other categories besides priority impact that are revealing. And one of them is, the city of San Jose was the first about 10 years ago to do this, degree of reliance on you as a service provider. And what that question was really about was, are we the only possible provider of this program, or are there others, be it public, private, nonprofit, who are out there now, and we just haven't had a chance to really come to understand what they're doing overall from a reliance perspective. Now, Councilmember, let me layer in some other of the data points which make this more nuanced. What if you find out that you are the sole provider, there's no possible partners, of a program that is a high priority, very much aligned with your priorities overall? You might say, that's great, we're the only possible people who can do it, and it really links to our priorities overall. That feels good, that's the right use of resources. But what about the opposite? What if you're the only possible provider of a program that doesn't have alignment with your priorities? You might say, who cares? That's the kind of discussion that we want to get into is, we might be the only possible provider of a program that has lost its relevance over time. And we got into it for all the right reasons, but we want to come back and apply some data to say, does it align with our priorities? Are we required to do it? What are the reasons? Does it pay for itself? So high degree of reliance, low impact on priorities. Are the users willing to pay for it with special revenues or fees? So that's a very distinct bucketed conversation for a unique kind of program that meets those criteria. That's what we want to try to isolate.
Yeah. Good example. Thank you.
Anyone else, questions? Christiane, do you want to add anything while you're up there?
Sure. I just, as Mark mentioned, we've been sort of strategizing in the lab about ways to increase our engagement with you throughout the budget process and earlier. So we've heard you, loud and clear on wanting more context, seeing more detail aside from just supplemental requests or decision packages, so that you have that deeper understanding as you're engaging in your districts and then making decisions in the budget process. We think that priority-based budgeting is going to be sort of the important tool to begin that journey and really make that happen. And so on the back of Chris's presentation on priority-based budgeting, I just wanted to share a couple of preliminary ideas that we have for this, fiscal year 25 budget development process for sharing more earlier and more consistently. And so happy to engage with you and hear your feedback on any of these ideas. So the first thing I wanted to sort of double down on and mention, Hillary mentioned it and Mark too, we'll be setting up time to meet with each of you on your fiscal year 25 budget priorities. That can be overarching, generic, specific, district specific. We want to hear all of that, and we'll get very familiar with your priorities, identify patterns and sort of how those fit into the big picture. I think everybody's on board with that idea. And then we'd like to add into the budget calendar some smaller, shorter sessions, work sessions, to preview a couple departments at a time, or maybe by priority, starting in as early as April, May, June. Not all-day budget work sessions, but short snippets that are fast-paced. And so we'd like to show you how the proposed budget is progressing. Part of this through the lens of PBB will be those program inventories that the participating departments have undergone. So we'd like you to have an understanding of the functions of each department, the core programs and what they cost, and maybe also the discretionary programs and what they cost, because that are maybe more discretionary than core give us the insight into resource allocation and where we can measure, competency by reduction, and not, or reallocation and not just adding programs and not knowing, where they fit in. Do you guys, what's your reaction to maybe some of those shorter, earlier work sessions in that vein? Is that good idea, thumbs up idea?
Thumbs up, Jeanette, go ahead.
Okay.
Christian, I think it would be maybe easier on you guys if we were invited to those departmental budget meetings with the city manager's office and just to sit in and hear what's going on. Not necessarily us, maybe staff, and they can fill us in, but that's another option.
Okay, thank you.
I would say the smaller snippets are very helpful. You're welcome to invite your district directors. You do not have time to sit through all those. I've sat through them. They are real long, and all of you are busy. But
can be very
your
long.
staff could be invited, absolutely, to give feedback or to you. But I think the way you're proposing it is a really wise way to do it so that they can digest some of their priorities and give you some feedback before you get too far down the budget process.
Great. Good. Yeah, we're hoping that we'll play with it and maybe have a reaction to this, whether we should do it by department or by strategic priority. I'd like to do it by strategic priority, and that way you can see, maybe you have a session on community investment, that's the strategic priority, and then there's subtopics like homelessness, and then under homelessness you can see police is homelessness, neighborhood services, code, and so you have this more holistic view of everything that's feeding up into that, strategic priority subtopic rather than going department by department and having to struggle to make those linkages with dollars, program performance. Okay. Any other ideas that you would like us to consider as we're sort of rolling out the budget calendar, or interjection points that you want to see? You can let me know.
Jeanette,
We
go
can
ahead.
talk about it more.
Sorry, just one more.
Yeah.
I think it'd be a good idea to hold, the community input is at the end of the budget process. So would it be possible to maybe create an online budget survey like we did for the Parks, Rec, and Open Space survey, and have that before you meet with the departments and get the input from the community ahead of time instead of at the end? And then that way, maybe they bring up something that we haven't heard about or we may forget to mention.
Yes, I like that idea. I'm looking at Amethyst, she's nodding her head that we can do that. Part of the reason that we've streamlined some of the functions we have streamlined in the lab, like the 2050 comprehensive plan, that engagement's kicking off. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to synthesize all those engagements that we're already doing. And so maybe some surveying and sort of multifaceted engagement with existing meetings will be helpful. Councilmember Williams, did you have a comment?
Yes, building on that, that was a really great point. I know we have meetings also at the end, and some of the feedback I typically hear is that the community engagements at the end of the process of the budget's baked, and any input they do give is kind of ancillary. Is there a way to front load some meetings in the spring so that then we can kind of round the corner in the budget timing around August to still do community meetings, but we can offer multiple opportunities for residents to give engagement on the front end and the back end to make sure that the product of the budget was delivered in a way that's acceptable to the residents.
As you're responding to that, let me throw this out there. We all struggle with the same people showing up to every meeting. And I think if we looked back at the last few budget cycles, those community meetings, you have maybe 0.05% of the total population of Fort Worth actually attending. We just need to accept that reality, that our typical format doesn't really work in community engagement. I'm sure you could point to every city struggles with this.
True.
So what technology could we employ to reach people? Probably via text, the same way you see campaigns, to polling people to say, are these your priorities, is where the city's kind of headed. Let's just brainstorm around that. I don't want us to create more community meetings for staff to attend that the same people are attending or not attending. But community engagement is very important, and each of you probably have some creative ways to do that or some ideas. So maybe we brainstorm on that with you and come back around so we're not pinning you down to a certain process.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. I have some ideas myself in my new position about more robust public engagement and in a more diverse way. So we'll add that to our agendas when we come and meet with you one-on-one and sort of hear, maybe what works for you.
And then I would encourage council members, it doesn't have to be today in an open forum, if there were things in the last budget cycle you experienced even before that where you were frustrated or a decision package you thought should have been included, or just vet that now so that they know moving into this next phase of priority-based budgeting. I think that'll just help everybody be more successful.
I'll mention something then. I mean, earlier, whenever we saw those colors, the pessimistic, optimistic base, like I said, I was breaking it down marine style for me is great. So that's, I think, being realistic about it and not just throwing just a number out there, but that would be super helpful.
That's great. Yeah, and certainly if we're engaging earlier, you're going to see a lot of that like preliminary scenario building because we won't quite know, till later in the summer. So yeah, I'm glad that was helpful.
Gina?
I think we all know our districts. Historically, I've always had very good numbers when it comes to public meetings, but in light of redistricting, I really don't know what to expect. I do know that the city of Fort Worth has a wonderful YouTube channel, and for whatever reason, people watch it. And so having something available for the citizenry would be helpful in terms of explaining, the budget. But I would still like to make sure there are in-person, options for people.
Absolutely.
And I really like the priority-based budgeting, like the concept. And David, continue to commend you on the creative ways you bring budgeting, to this body. Is finance still fun? I haven't heard that. Okay. So,
Great.
Any other questions or comments, council? No. Chris, thank you very much. We're excited to work with you.
Thank you.
Why aren't you on a beach if your company sold?
There's
wanted you to
there's a
stay
lot of good
today.
reasons, but one of them is
Right.
I love this work. I come from the public sector, and this is what I'm all about. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Chris. Appreciate it. Council will close things out with defining expectations with Hillary. Is this like a counseling session? What are we going to do here? It's like a DTR for council.
That's right. Okay. All right. So we've been through quite a bit today, and I just wanted to take a moment to make sure that we're all on the same page as we walk away from today. First things first is I will shape up all of the discussion that we had today and provide it back to you all so that you can officially adopt your priorities, strategic priorities. As you can see with the priority-based budgeting, that becomes so important on how things are tracked and measured. And so you heard from staff what they plan to do, coming back to you to try and address some of your district-specific priorities through the budgeting process. But also this should be an ongoing conversation. So I hope that we have all the pieces and the parts that we need. This isn't the end of the conversation. It will come back. It needs to be affirmed by you all so that staff can charge out and they can develop a budget with this new kind of framework in mind, and one that meets your overarching priorities, but then also your district specific. So are there any specific items that we discussed today or that we glossed over today that you have concerns about or want to ensure are part of our next steps moving forward?
Concerns, comments, questions? No?
Then we're
We're in good shape.
We're good to
Yeah.
go.
Thank you very much, Hillary. Council, thank y'all for doing that today. I hope this setup was helpful, not to ask you to come back up here on another day, utilizing a work session time period. If you have more feedback for Hillary, you know how to get a hold of her. And I guess with that, I'm looking around the table, we're good. Meeting adjourned.